to the One-on-One podcast with your host, Juan Ayala.
Welcome back to another episode of the One-on-One podcast. I'm your host, as always. Make sure to check out the show on social media at the One-on-One podcast on pretty much all social media platforms. One-on-One on YouTube, Rumble, everywhere. www.tjojp.com, patreon.com/the One-on-One podcast, all that good stuff. And joining us today is a scholar, a publisher, a book owner, somebody who is one of my favorite guests to have on the show because he knows a lot. Welcome back to the show, Professor Longo, dude. What's up, man?
Of course, not much. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. And we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the things in your book, Monad, that you just published through your publishing company. And beautiful cover, beautiful art on the inside as well. And we're going to be talking about Thomas Taylor. We're going to be talking about Neoplatonism, Platonism, and whatever else comes up. But before we get started, where can people get a copy of this tome? And where can they look for other projects that are coming up that you were sharing with me that I'm very excited for?
Sure. Yeah, you can get a copy of Monad at Gallowglassbooks.shop. We're on Instagram and everything like that. Or you could look up The Dancing Elephant, which is the bookstore I own in South Florida, and that'll lead you to Monad. We have the link everywhere. There's less than 400 copies left, and it is limited to 2,000 copies.
Whoa.
So we printed 2,000 in July. It sold really well. They're going fast. So there's only a few hundred, and they'll probably be sold out in the next month or two, and then we're moving on to the next book. And Monad will never be republished. It could be republished in paperback, but we have no commitment to that. But the hardcover is limited. They're treasures. You know, if you're into Neoplatonism, it's kind of the book to have. And then our next book in March, hopefully in March, if we stay on track, is going to be Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition by Francis Yates. Fully restored with a commission cover, and it'll be really cool.
Awesome. Yeah, make sure to check that out. Links down in the description. And I was telling you that I'd done a couple episodes of Yates because she was just so ahead of her time, and a lot of the things, right? The Yates narrative, as they call it, this idea that she presents this grand narrative that you're able to, which a lot of scholars call, imagination going wild type of thing. But
yeah, she gets heckled by some more, like, I guess, cold scholars. Yeah, like you said, for using a little imagination, something like that.
Yeah, which I appreciate Yates because she goes where I think people, when they're reading her work, want to go, right? Yeah. In a sort of way like, oh, that's really crazy. Well, it just so might be that crazy. And she presents it again. She's a scholar, so she's presenting in a way that makes a lot of sense. Now, a lot of the stuff that she does claim is crazy, but history is crazy. Alchemy is crazy, right? Hermeticism is crazy. And I wanted to ask you, a Gallowglass. What is all this about? I'm reading it here. I never knew about this.
So I actually graduated college about 3 years ago. I'm pretty young, and I started a hedge fund, started an investment partnership. I went through all the hoops, licensing, all of that, and I was trying to think of a name for it. And I'm Irish, and I love knights, like I like Arthurian stuff and all that. And so I looked up like Irish knights, and it came up the Gallowglass, and I was like, "Oh, that's a cool word." And then I looked into what it was all about, and basically the Gallowglass were a mercenary class. They were a class of people, very similar to like the samurai. It was like a class that you lived in, And what they were is they were foreigners, typically Scandinavian or Scottish men who were huge warriors and were hired as mercenaries to fight for lords and dukes in Ireland, in Britain. And, basically back then it was a feudal system. So you had serfs, you had peasants that rented, their land from you, and a lord or a duke, had his plot of land, and that was all you really had. I mean, so basically you had all these land disputes between lords and dukes. And when they would get in these little battles, they would need a standing army. And look, you're not going to be hiring your peasants and your serfs to be fighting for you. They're malnourished. They don't like you. They're illiterate, they're not a very good army. And they have political, they want to kill you, if anything, not kill the other guy. So they would have to hire, the Gallowglass. And they're really interesting. You see things like the Varangian Guard, the Byzantine Empire, similar, where they would hire Scandinavian Vikings to be like this sort of secret service for the Roman Emperor, because again, they didn't have local political allegiances or like ideas. So like, you hire somebody from the other side of the world, like they don't really care what's going on in your town or your country. They're like, you're paying me, okay, I'll listen. They don't have an agenda, so to speak. Yeah, I love the name. And after I started the hedge fund, I bought a bookstore and went down that route because I couldn't turn that opportunity down. And then so the name was still available. And when we started publishing last year, I was like, oh, let's just keep that name. I mean, that's a cool name. So, yeah.
Did the Knights Templar and them ever go to battle? I mean, they were kind of around the same time, right? So
it's a good question. Yeah, I don't know what the crossover was there. I know
what the collab was.
Yeah, what the collab was. I know the Knights Templar are more centered in like France and England, whereas the Gallowglass were primarily in Ireland. I'm sure there was collab. I'm sure there was crossover. I would bet that Gallowglass were sent to the Crusades and things like that, and probably joined the Templar. I'd only be speculating though.
Well, it's interesting here. The Irish called them Gael or Gael, foreign Gaels, and it's almost like the Holy Grail. It's like right along those lines.
Yeah. I think that the anglicized version is Gallowglass, but the original Gaelic is something like Gallowglass, and Gaul is like foreign. It means like like Gaul, like outside of Rome. It's like the
you've got the Gaul to tell me. Is that where that comes from? Right?
Probably does. But like Portugal is Port to Gaul. So Gaul kind of just meant like a foreign land or the territory outside of Rome. And so that's where the word comes from. It means foreign warrior, basically.
Interesting. Yeah, I never heard it until you said that. You said it just now. I was like, it's gotta have some significance. And then I looked it up and it's like some mercenary warriors. What?
Yeah.
That was wild.
Yeah, we didn't pick a random name. Thank gosh.
Makes sense.
So always pressure, picking names.
Is that glass behind you real, dude? Is that like some Tiffany glass or anything?
It's a stained glass, but not Tiffany, no.
Or you wouldn't know. Did you ever see that article where I think it was like a church or something had some glass, and it turned out to be crazy expensive?
I didn't see that, but I'm familiar with Tiffany glass. Yeah, I've been to people's houses who had it. I went to a book collector, and he collected it, and I was like, oh my God, like a private collection. He invited me to go see, and he had Tiffany lamps and stuff. It was crazy.
Is it this one? Sold that rare Tiffany glass? I think they sold it as regular.
Wow.
And then they ended up finding out that it was like super, super expensive. And,
oh yeah. It was sizable. I'm sure it was crazy.
Because, right, these guys, right, speaking of Gallowglass and all this stuff, like glass is part of alchemy, right? Like the furnace and the heat and the thing about Tiffany glass, I believe it was, that they couldn't figure out how they got the color for it, how they got it so vibrant. He had like a specific certain process that was able to make it look the way it looked. And that's like esoteric right there. That's a cult where only a certain class of people know the certain trade. Like if you look at like the Freemasons or something, like do they actually hold some secrets of the occult, or is it some secrets of the trade, or like what is it? And I imagine that it starts off like that, like a secret of the trade.
Sure.
And then from there, it kind of sort of evolves into something more secret society-ish.
Yeah.
To where they keep it inside.
I've heard, at least from various people, that at one point, Freemasonry kind of won out and stuck around. But I've heard that at one point in time, basically every craft had its own guild or its own society that used the language or vocabulary of that craft as analogy for spiritual matters. So like painters would be talking about, instead of compasses and things, they'd be talking about paintbrushes and canvases and, what have you. So almost every craft, or a blacksmith, their guild would be using blacksmithing jargon or vocab for spiritual metaphor. But that Freemasonry is the one that stuck around,
Yeah, that would make sense. No, that definitely, where it's like, again, and that's what alchemy is all about, where it's like, is it the actual work? Is it the magnum opus? Or is it, how you're saying, this spiritual movement of how to transcend reality with the soul, or become more pure, or whatever it is? And this is the thing I was talking about. This is 2023, bought for $6,000. Grime covered windows are actually Tiffany and worth up to $250,000 each at a Philadelphia church. They sold it to a collector and nobody knew how. So he probably swindled. He's like, I know how much these are worth. I'm going to get them for super cheap. And so check that out. I mean, that's
insane.
That's crazy looking, bro.
Never heard about that.
Looks like a nebula and stuff in here. You see that?
Yeah.
Whoa. And again, right, speaking about Francis Yates and the Knights Templar and everything, and the idea of, Fulcanelli and the Mystery of the Cathedrals, which would be another good book too,
That'd be great. Yeah.
to do this concept of, did they hide the secrets of the magnum opus within the walls of these cathedrals? Why were they so magnificent? Why were they so beautiful? Why were they so intricate? And more importantly, who the hell funded all these buildings and all the ones that we lost throughout time? Because a lot of them were destroyed in whatever places,
Tons of them, yeah.
So he paid $6,000 to purchase the pair, as well as some wooden pews and doors. And there, he brought them to Windows to Freeman's Philadelphia, an auction house, for appraisal. There, Brown learned that they were worth much more than he had originally paid, $150,000 to $250,000 each. Yikes, bro!
Wow.
Talk about what a great find. I mean, what would you do in that? So I think this is where they sold them. I wonder how much they sold Thursday for hundreds of.
Those are crazy.
So how much
They're super cool.
What should they sell for? Do they know? Do we know here? See the transcripts. So they actually sold them, and they sold. Let's see here. The pair went up for auction, $95,000. Looking for $100,000 is next. The window sold for $100,000 each. And you got them for $6,000.
That's crazy.
But look how beautiful that is, dude.
Yeah, those are awesome. They probably belong in a better venue, honestly, than just that little gallery.
Yeah, but if you get something like this, how would you even know what to, like, how to?
Yeah, I agree.
You know what I'm saying? Like, where would you even put this unless you are part of that industry where you're able to look at that? They're like held together by like these little.
No way. Little ties.
Yeah, dude, this is crazy. So, yeah, the concept of this occulted knowledge being kind of sort of hidden within these buildings. Can we talk about Thomas Taylor, this guy? He's really interesting. I had told you I had heard about a Thomas Taylor another Thomas Taylor, because I've always known about Thomas Taylor, but I never really knew anything about him. I knew he had translated a bunch of works, and when I had stumbled across that other book, A Voyage to the World of Cartesius, I thought it was this guy, but I was like, the timelines aren't matching up. You know, this guy's 18th century, that other book is 17th century. Like, it didn't line up. And when you look up the other T. Taylor, you don't get anything. Like, it's like, it's a work of satire. The author's name was like some Jesuit monk or something. Yeah. He contributed to like the lexicon of Descartes. He was like a Descartes esotericist. And when you look him up, it's literally just that he wrote that one book on Descartes and like contributed to like some lexicon or some other thing. And there's nothing else. Gabriel Daniel, very biblical name, nothing else. A work of satire. Was it? Does it have some hidden meaning? And it was translated by T. Taylor. But obviously this whole thing, there's a lot of works. He was a pagan and all that. Can we talk a little bit about this Thomas Taylor?
Sure. Yeah. So Thomas Taylor, he was a Taurus, by the way.
Oh, wow.
Like yourself, I believe.
Yeah.
He was born in the late 1700s. He was a savant, meaning he was not just good at what he did. He was like the Jimi Hendrix of what he did, you know, like he was a translator of ancient Greek into English. He was the first translator to go from ancient Greek directly to English, at least of anyone doing anything important. So all of the works of Plato and Aristotle and the Neoplatonists, Emperor Julian, all of these important works of Greece and Rome that were written in ancient Greek had never been translated directly into English. They had been translated into Latin, so from Greek to Latin to English. But in that triangulation, you get a lot of, tomfoolery going on. And also people would be taking Ficino's translations from the Renaissance, from Greek to Latin, and then they'd be translating off of his Latin. So basically, any time up until him that ancient Greek was making its way into English, it was kind of a disaster. And he came along and was able to create the infrastructure to translate from ancient Greek directly into English. And then he just went off. He translated the complete works of Aristotle, complete works of Plato, complete works of Plotinus, Porphyry, Proclus, Julian, all of these people. If you see his complete works of what he translated in one lifetime, it's disgusting. Like, you could just line up books for it's totally ridiculous. So you fill up a room, and these are not easy things to translate. They're some of the most complex things.
Whoa, dude.
Yeah, it's like unbelievable. Oh, Iamblichus, of course, as well. Yeah, totally wild. I mean, look at what he's doing just in 1 year.
How are you finding enough time for this is my question.
Yeah. So he was obsessed. All he cared about was ancient Greek and Platonism. He was a Platonist. That's the important distinction. Other people translate. He was a master translator as well as a philosopher. And so when he's translating from Plato into English, he will tweak things as a philosopher because he has such a deep understanding of the stuff, studying it in the classical Greek with his Platonic education. He understands the metaphysics and the logic, the cosmology, all of it down to a T. I mean, he could write the stuff himself. And so when he goes to translate, like, what comes out the other end is just the only thing worth reading as far as Platonism goes. If you're reading other translators, I mean, it's probably okay. I'm not saying that they're mistranslating, but they might not actually understand what this material is. And so they're translating it on a literal basis. And that's not always the best way to be translating, because a lot of words have different connotations in our language. And philosophy is ultimately a game of language, of describing things. So the translation is very important. These things are not, it's not, oh, what translation of War and Peace are you reading? These are important. Like if Plotinus or Plato is saying something, you want to make sure that you understand it and that the translator understood it too. So he's a huge deal. He caused a Platonic revival in England in the early 1800s. He was friends with William Blake, friends with a lot of other movers and shakers in the world of philosophy. And you see after him that it was like a drop of LSD into the culture. All these people in the Victorian era and then into the late 1800s, early 1900s, all the way up to people like Manly P. Hall are still reading Thomas Taylor. And, a lot of times too, like if you read Monad, it'll be a chapter and it has his footnotes. So you're reading his footnotes and then which are treasures, trust me. And then after the chapter, it'll be notes on, the chapter before, and they're notes from him. It's almost like a little commentary at the end. So what you're getting with Taylor is just, and I will say, yes, we sell books, but all of Thomas Taylor's translations are public domain. Please go read them online. They're all free. I mean, yes, if you want them in a beautiful book, buy our book, but regardless, people should be reading them. He's extremely important. He was rumored to have spoken Greek in the kitchen with his ancient Greek with his wife. Like him and his wife would be talking about people in ancient Greek. So they couldn't.
Was her dad one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence? John Morton? Is that the same one?
I don't know. That'd be interesting.
Because it says here in so he married his childhood sweetheart, Mary Morton, daughter of John Morton.
Yeah, could be.
And
Definitely.
John Morton
signed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be speculating, but it could be, definitely. I mean, if his name was worthy of being mentioned in Wikipedia, it's possible. But he's a big deal. Growing up, I would watch Santos Bonacci when I was like in late high school and in college. He was big back then. And Santos Bonacci is a Neoplatonist. That is his worldview, is like syncretism, Neoplatonism. So I was always hearing about Neoplatonism and Plato. My older brother read the complete works of Plato and was always talking about Plato. I studied him in school too. And, that's one of the best places to start with philosophy. And Santos would always be mentioning Thomas Taylor. He would say, like, hey, if you're reading Plato or the Neoplatonists, make sure you're reading Thomas Taylor's translations. I know this isn't your thing, but the Greek philosophers were all vegetarian, and Thomas Taylor was also a vegetarian. So he totally walked the walk. Like everything about he lived as if he was an ancient Greek philosopher. So like this is the guy that you want to be reading. Anyway, Santos would talk about him all the time, and I kind of just shelved it in the back of my mind. But I went into the bookstore that we ended up buying when I was a customer there. The guy had run it for 50 years.
Whoa.
And I remember being in there one time. So yeah, he knew a lot. I remember being in there one time.
Is he still around?
Yep. Yeah, he's retired, but he's still around.
Podcast with him, bro.
That'd be crazy. Yeah, he's 85. And he's been doing this stuff his entire life. And he, one time, I was in there, and he said, if you're reading the Platonists, like Iamblichus, who has a book on Pythagoras called The Life of Pythagoras, it's really good.
I bought it from your store.
It's translated by Thomas Taylor.
Yeah.
The one you have. So that he had that book in his store, and he said, like, hey, this is translated by this guy, Thomas Taylor. If you're reading the Platonists, make sure you're reading from these translations. And so then I had this kind of confirmation between Santos and this guy, Tomasz, who I bought the bookstore from. independently of each other. And in my head, I remember thinking like, oh wow, like this must be some translator, because I keep hearing his name, from people who clearly know what they're talking about. And it's not often you hear a translator, of that notoriety.
Yeah, and I think it is the Mary, because I looked up here, American politician had 5 daughters, and down here it talks about his daughters.
Oh wow.
3 sons, 5 daughters: Aaron, Sketchley, John, Mary, Sarah, Lydia, and Elizabeth.
Nice.
So
yeah, that's an interesting connection.
I think it's the same people, but it is interesting, right? One of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Let me confirm that. As a delegate to the Continental Congress during the American Revolution, he was a signatory to the Continental Association and Declaration of Independence.
Right.
Well,
Thomas Taylor's a father-in-law, seems like.
Yeah, I mean, right? So Morton provided the swing vote that allowed Pennsylvania to vote in the favor of the Declaration. So this guy was like pivotal to that whole thing, or else they'd literally be hung, and we probably wouldn't be here right now.
Yeah.
Because I'd be on my trash island in the Caribbean.
That's funny. Yeah. Nice. One thing that you mentioned was oftentimes Thomas Taylor is seen as being a sort of, I wouldn't say martyr, because it's not like he was killed, but kind of like a hero for neo-paganism or paganism in general, because he was living obviously in that time at a very Christian, he was in England, a very Christian time.
Mm-hmm.
It was not cool or interesting or even really acceptable to, be taking Greek philosophy as primary over Christianity. And so he kind of went against the grain because that's what he loved. And so he is seen as being kind of part of the revival of paganism. And paganism the term gets thrown around a lot. I'm not talking about like wearing goat horns and whatever. I'm talking about like just, classical religion and spirituality from the ancient world, which the Greek tradition is very much at the forefront of. So he does get lumped in as a pagan quite often. People label him like that, which is not bad.
Yeah, definitely a sympathizer, right? Like he was.
Yeah.
He said he was kind of sort of practicing it, and did he call Iamblichus the most divine? Is that him, or do they call Iamblichus the most divine?
Yeah, a lot of times Taylor probably did call him that, but I know that Emperor Julian, I don't know if you're familiar with Julian, but really interesting figure. He was actually a Byzantine emperor, Roman emperor, who famously said that he would give up like the whole empire for a few letters back and forth with Iamblichus.
Really?
Yeah, like Iamblichus is unreal. His book On the Mysteries we will be publishing eventually, and is well worth reading, especially the Taylor translation. Iamblichus is interesting. He's the bad boy of Neoplatonism. So kind of how Aristotle was to Plato, where, in ancient Greece, you have Socrates and then Plato, his student, and then Aristotle is Plato's student. So there's a lineage.
Mm-hmm.
But Aristotle sort of is the bad boy as well, where he turns on a lot of what Plato was into. Like his theory of forms now becomes this very much materialist philosophy of Aristotle, things like that he basically completely flipped on a lot of Platonic ideas. And the same thing happens in the Neoplatonists. I guess a little bit of background. The Neoplatonists are Roman philosophers. They spoke Greek. So a lot of people will call them Greek philosophers, and that's fine. They're in the Greco-Roman tradition. They lived primarily in Alexandria, Egypt, which at the time was occupied by Rome, the Roman Empire, or they lived in Rome itself. And the godfather of Neoplatonism, the founder, was Plotinus. And Plotinus starts up in Alexandria and in Rome. I think he traveled back and forth a little bit. And he starts up his own school. He had a very famous teacher named Ammonius Saccas. It's pulled up right there, actually. And he's important. He's kind of like a sage that we don't know much about, but he taught some really important people like Origen, who's an early Christian theologian, and obviously Plotinus and others. And so Plotinus restarts this movement of Platonism. Aristotle's philosophy had ruled over philosophy for a few hundred years, and Plotinus wants to return to the pure philosophy of Plato, just Platonic philosophy. He does work in Aristotle, so it's not like he totally ignores him, but he wants to get back more to Plato. And then Plotinus's student was Porphyry, who's also in Monad. And Porphyry is really important. He writes a bunch of books, and then later on,
he writes a bunch of books. That's why he's important.
Yeah, well, we'll get into more details, but just so people have a kind of general layout. And then you have Iamblichus, who we were just talking about, who's the bad boy, because so Plotinus and Porphyry kind of have their ideas, and they think very similarly. They don't really disagree on much. But then Iamblichus is the third in line, just like Aristotle was, and rebels on a lot of things, a lot of important ideas. Like he thinks that the soul is fully descended into the body. He thinks that matter in the material world plays a much larger role in his cosmology and in the ascent back to the divine than Plotinus would. So he does disagree with a lot. But he is razor sharp, like total. I mean, he is, all these guys were just, they were being raised from the time they were little kids to be philosophers, and they would attend a Platonic academy or be tutored by, these great minds. And, they were not learning about whatever, zoology or, geography or something. They were learning about philosophy. And if they were learning about things like math or science or whatever it was all as it relates to Platonic philosophy. And so if you throw up a big question, the biggest questions, like what is justice? What is the soul? How does the world come into being out of nothing? Like you could think of the big questions. And these guys just are like ChatGPT. They just fire back, like their minds were so sharp that I say it in Monad. I wrote the little flaps on the book. And I say it in there. I don't think, and I've done a lot of reading, I don't think anybody since the Neoplatonists has tackled these topics with as sharp of a mind. There's been a lot of really smart people and a lot of really interesting ideas, but I don't read anyone where I'm like, wow, like the intellect on these guys is like ferocious. It's almost, they're like gladiators. Like they were just born to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so reading them's a pleasure, but you do see that, that weird archetypal, almost like family aspect where the third in line rebels against the previous two. So you have Socrates, Plato, and then Aristotle's the third, and he rebels against a lot of what they taught. And then you have Plotinus, Porphyry, and then Iamblichus rebels against what the previous two had taught. And you see this played out in myth. So it's an archetypal pattern. You see it in Star Wars. You have Qui-Gon Jinn, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and then Anakin is the bad boy. It's always the third one. You have
think about that.
You have the master, and then you have his sort of loyal star student who takes his teachings, doesn't ask any questions, and then the third in line is like, wait a minute, what are we doing here? And they start to question, they start to break away. And you see that played out in philosophy too, which is funny.
And what would you say? So, right, they believe in the one, which is right, the monad, the source.
Right. So Neoplatonism
Just want to remind everyone, make sure to check out the show on Patreon, patreon.com/the One-on-One podcast. I constantly get emails. Oh, only one episode a week. Yeah, one episode a week for the public, but for as little as $5 a month, you can get up to 2, sometimes 3, sometimes one episode per day on the Patreon, as well as on the YouTube channel as a member for as little as $5. And there's also on the Patreon over 250 episodes only found on there. There's an extensive backlog of episodes. So check that out. If for those interested, for those asking, make sure to follow the show on YouTube, One Podcast. Also, One Media. I am going live every Tuesday on there streaming. I also go live on twitch.tv/One Podcast. So make sure to check me out on there Tuesdays, 6 p.m. Eastern. And make sure to get your copy of the Occultus Mundi Homunculus Owner's Manual, all that good stuff at tjojp.com. Can pick up your copies there or go over to the Ko-Fi. I'm on Facebook, Twitch, Kick, Rumble, all that good stuff. You know where to find it. And enjoy this episode.
The basics are that it's a hierarchical cosmology. What that means is they want to start with the source and then work their way back, down to right now. They don't want to start with right here and then sort of reverse engineer back to the source, which
is religion nowadays. Like you're working in this life for the afterlife.
Yeah. They want to start with the biggest possible question, which is what is God? What is the absolute? What is the source of the universe, source of all things? For them, they call it the monad, the one. And then from there, you get this top-down model, a cascading great chain of being that comes from the Neoplatonists, or a hierarchy of things that are higher levels of being or higher levels of order, which work their way down to the material world, which is, of course, at the bottom. So that's where you get Neoplatonism, or the Platonic cosmology, is they start with the one, which is two things. It is beyond being itself, meaning it's entirely transcendent. That's why it's mystical, Neoplatonism. It's entirely beyond being. So even being, like existence, is a thing, a concept, or a experience that is within it. It's not even subject to that. It's beyond that. And so it, in some sense, doesn't exist at all. It's entirely beyond any words. But yet, at the same time, because it's everything, like God would be, because it's also everything, it's entirely immanent, meaning it's also here at all times. Everything is a part of it. And these are kind of strange ideas to get used to, but once you get, I kind of call it once you get initiated into the Platonic way of thinking, you never go back. Whether you agree or not doesn't matter. It's just a different way of looking at things. They're always trying to reconcile dualities. So that's sort of their method for going up, climbing the ladder up to the one, is to identify contradictions or dualities and solve them with what they call a dialectic. So they'll use a dialectic to sort of reconcile two opposites into one sort of solution or unity that contains those two opposites within it. A good example is beauty. One of Plotinus' most famous essays in the Enneads, which is in Monad, is, and you can actually hear Manly P. Hall has a good lecture on this. It's called On Beauty by Plotinus. And in that, he is trying to get to the bottom of what beauty is. And that's a big question. And, sort of reiterate, their method is this dialectical method. So what he'll start with is saying, okay, what is beauty? And someone might say, oh, beauty is symmetry. and he'll say, well, beauty is not symmetry, but symmetry is beautiful. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And then, someone, he'll kind of come back, because he's always kind of just talking with himself. He'll say, well, can asymmetry be beautiful? And of course the answer is yes, right? You can look at a beautiful home, like a house that's asymmetrical, one side's tall, one side's short, or whatever it is. You could look at a beautiful face that's asymmetrical. You could look at, Japanese artwork tends to be asymmetrical. So asymmetry can always, of course, be beautiful. And so by taking these two opposites of symmetry and asymmetry, he's looking for what is the unifying principle, the form of beauty that is being found in these two opposites. And by pitting them against each other, it's almost like alchemy. By pitting these two opposites against each other, he can extract the essence that's contained in them. And he's doing this all mentally. These are contemplative processes. It's like a meditation.
Thought experiments, yeah.
Yeah, he'll sit there and just think and think and think. Well, okay, if symmetry is beautiful, asymmetry is beautiful, what the hell is beauty? Because it's in both of these, and it's not either one. And the answer that you sort of get to is it is a transcendent principle. Transcendent meaning it's not here. It's not. You can't look at beauty itself with a capital B. Like the actual idea of beauty is not just like out here walking around. The things that are out here walking around or on walls as paintings are participating in a higher order idea that is beauty with a capital B. And that's called a form. And these are Platonic forms, and things participate in them. And so by using that dialectic, he can now have an awareness or a realization of forms, which are a very high order of things, of intellect. And by climbing this ladder, so to speak, upwards, using the dialectical method and reasoning, you can get to these states of being where you can sort of be comprehending, understanding the forms themselves. And once you're doing that, I mean, you're really a smart cookie. You understand how things work, so to speak. And that really is Platonism, is the ascent back to the one, back to the source, through reason, for the most part, through thinking. So it's almost like anti-Buddhism or something. You're not trying to annihilate the mind. You're trying to use your God-given intellect, because the Greeks think of intellect. Oftentimes you hear intellect untranslated as just nous, which is a Greek word. And they thought that the nous in your mind,
the universal mind,
right, is a connection to the divine mind. It's a little piece of the divine mind that you have. And so they thought, wow, like annihilate your mind. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. Like these meditation people, you're like, just turn it off. They're like, what the hell? Like, this is like our gift. This is like the way out. This is like what we've been given. When you hear people like in the Bible say that we're made in God's image, it's like that, like the intellect in your mind is our rope up to the great
Jacob's ladder,
to the divine intellect that is the whole world. And so they would, their form of contemplation or meditation was like a supercharged mind. They were like, wow, like if this is my connection to the divine, my intellect, I need to purify myself. I need to be moral and ethical, and I need to make sure that this intellect is sharp, as close to the divine intellect as possible. And then we can start working upwards to sort of realize the source, realize where everything comes from, the absolute, to see the whole world as it is. And one of the things I really liked about the Neoplatonists was when you reach that state of total awareness of the one, it's kind of an enlightenment state, I guess you would say, or a nirvana type of thing. you don't stay there. So you don't just check out. You actually now in the Neoplatonic tradition have a duty to responsibility to come back down like a lightning bolt back into your body and view the world almost like a superhero who sees the world supercharged, where you see the source of everything. So if you see a computer, you see the form of computer, the idea of a computer from which that particular computer is emanating from. So you almost see like X-ray vision where things are coming from. And their sources are where their power comes from, so to speak. They are almost symbols for, these concepts, these pure concepts. They are diluted material versions of the pure idea of something. And you have realized those ideas, those forms, and now you see things in a completely different way. And that was sort of the path, so to speak, of the Neoplatonists.
Whoa, dude. Yeah, I've always kind of they're emanationists, right? Where everything that we're observing now is an emanation of the source of the one.
Yeah. So the one, their cosmology more or less is the one or the monad or the absolute is, like I said, it is a completely transcendent thing. It's not a thing at all. It's not a being. It's it's a big circle that every single thing, I'm speaking metaphorically, obviously, that every single thing or idea or form of being is inside of. And so you have the one, and then you have the nous, which is the divine mind. It is the intellect. It is where the forms are located, obviously, not spatially located, because they're not like floating around. And then you have the world soul. You have the anima mundi. And then you have the material world.
Now, this makes a lot more sense to me, what Flood was trying to get at.
Yeah. So, we can get into that, but basically all of the Renaissance were Neoplatonists. All of them. The Renaissance painters were painting Neoplatonic ideas. People like Michelangelo. It's been said that you can't even understand Michelangelo or Renaissance painting without understanding Neoplatonism. It was so much a part of the time, because basically what happened was, and I've talked about this on your show before, but when the Roman Empire falls in like 500-ish, and we're talking about the Western Roman Empire, the capital of the Roman Empire has moved to Constantinople, which we now call the Byzantine Empire. And after the Roman Empire falls in Western Europe, so France, Germany, England, Spain, all those countries, they are left in what's called the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages, for almost 1,000 years. The reason that they're called the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages is they lost their connection to the classical world, to the ancient world. So when the Roman Empire fell in the Western Europe, with them, all the knowledge was lost temporarily. They didn't know how to build domes. They didn't know how to build arches. They didn't read Plato. They didn't have Plato in the Middle Ages at all in Western Europe. So people like St. Thomas Aquinas, or people who are big philosophers in the Middle Ages, did not have the Platonists. And so they're Aristotelians, they're materialists, which is kind of leads to a dark age, materialism. And, of course, there's like economic factors too. They had a feudal system and all of that. So it's kind of a disaster overall. But in the East, in Turkey, in Constantinople, you had the Byzantine Empire. They were the remnants of the Roman Empire, and they still had everything. They still had Plato. They still had the Neoplatonists. They had Plotinus, all these people. They still had the writings, and they were balling out. And they were building domes and arches, and they had all the classical knowledge of sculpture and perspective and whatever. And and they were doing great. And what happens is the Byzantine Empire falls to the Turks, the Muslim invaders, and that's in the 1400s. And what happens is all of the Romans, they spoke Greek too, from the Byzantine Empire, come back to Western Europe, to Italy, and bring with them all of the classical knowledge. They bring back Plato, they bring back Plotinus, they bring back the architecture, all of that. And this causes the Renaissance in Italy. And one of the first things the Medicis did, I believe it's the Medicis, was hire Marsilio Ficino to translate the Hermetic corpus, all of the Hermetic texts coming back from Constantinople, which again had been absent from Western Europe, and translate Plato, translate Plotinus, translate all of these amazing Platonist philosophers, and also had Ficino start a Platonic academy in Rome. Or maybe it was in Florence. I'm not sure.
He was the first one before Taylor, right? That had like kickstarted the revival.
You're right. He translated everything in Latin, and that causes a revival of Platonism that fuels the Renaissance, fuels all the mysticism of the Renaissance. And many people believe, by the way, that the advent of Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry in the late 1500s, early 1600s, was a way of codifying this Platonic knowledge that had been lost. So because it had been lost in the Middle Ages, the elite or the educated in Europe didn't ever want to lose it again. And they said, how can we codify it? How can we make this into a system, systematize it, and preserve it forever? And people do suspect that Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism were ways to take Platonic classical education or worldview and systematize it in a way that everyone can be, not everyone, but could be initiated into in successive states, so that that Western Europe would not fall into a dark age again. And I believe that it's probably true. It's probably a big reason behind it, at least.
What do you say? Because I've always said that the Platonists and the Neoplatonists and all these guys, they paved the way for Christianity. Because, like they were very, or the Gnostics, at least, and from there you have everything else. Is that accurate to say? Because I'm sure I can think of a few people or scholars that would disagree and be like, Christians were their own thing, and then they did their own thing, and they evolved, on their own. It's like they didn't pick up any pagan traditions or anything like that.
Yeah, I'm not gonna like downplay Christianity in any way, of course. But Christianity evolved in a context. It did not evolve in a vacuum. And the context of Christianity is a Roman-occupied Middle East and North Africa and Europe. And so Christianity evolved in Rome, and it evolved in primarily in Greek-speaking parts of Rome. So the idea that it could escape without being influenced by Roman and Greek philosophy is obviously silly. And absolutely early Christianity, particularly the theology. So it's not, I wouldn't say anything like, it was being like written into the Bible or anything like that. It was more that, although the Gospel of John could be Neoplatonic, it was more that the theologians, the philosophers of early Christianity, had to fall back on something, some kind of, way of orienting the world that they could work their biblical knowledge onto, some kind of framework. Mm-hmm. And Neoplatonism was absolutely the framework for early Christian theology. In the Greek Orthodox Church, or the Eastern Orthodox Church, maintains a lot more Neoplatonic ideas, like particularly about the Trinity and things like that. than like the Catholic or Protestant churches. But what you see is that these theologians, I mean, to be perfectly honest, if you read the Bible, there's not that much theology in it.
Well,
right?
think about this.
Not that it's not there, but it's symbolic, or it's in kind of blanket statements. It's not like the Bible is going deep diving into particulars of theology. And so these issues had to be worked out. And the environment that they're being worked out in is a Neoplatonic environment. Like people like Origen, who's a really important early Christian theologian, or Saint Augustine. These people, like Augustine, was reading Plotinus. Augustine was a Neoplatonist, dare I say, and obviously one of the most important Christian theologians ever. Origen was sort of one of the earliest, and Origen was in the same class as Plotinus. Like they had the same teacher. They were like classmates. And so, yes, we definitely know that Christian
That was an
theology,
interesting high school reunion, right?
yeah. So we definitely know that Christian theology was influenced by Neoplatonism, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's not like saying that takes away from it or anything. They just were using, and I think that Neoplatonism is often termed like syncretism, because it's Neoplatonism or Plato, all the Platonists. There's not a lot of symbolism, meaning like the one or the monad is an idea. It's not a god. It's not a person.
It's not like angels and Nephilim and all that interesting stuff.
They have levels of ideas. They're concepts. They're not things that you can get attached to. And I think that makes it the perfect sort of skeleton to put something else on. So you can take Christian symbolism, like the God, God the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and apply that to Neoplatonism. You can sort of project these things onto it. And if anything, it's at least an interesting thought experiment. It gives you at least something to chew on. And that's absolutely what was going on. And again, in the Renaissance, Platonism was, giving a lot of these philosophical ideas don't contradict anything biblically, or contradict anything in Christianity, and therefore could coexist with it. People like Kant would use Platonic ideas to offer proofs of God. Things like Kant's transcendental argument for God. You often hear it called TAG, like TAG. That's a argument, formal, like logical argument, where he offers, it's a Platonic cosmology, which he says necessitates a divine mind, necessitates a God. So he says, we have these things that are categories or numbers or ideas which are transcendental, meaning they are not, like we said earlier, the number one is not out here in the world. It's an idea. It's a pure principle. And when you see one of something, it's participating in that idea, in that form, of oneness. And, and there's various versions of this, but these categories, these things which unify things, when you say, oh, that's a horse and that's a horse and that's a horse, but none of them are the same horse, but there's something there that unifies all horses, and these transcendentals, these categories by which we view the world, have to be held in some mind. They can't just be things we extract out of nature, because it's the other way around. Nature is sort of being extracted out of them. Mm-hmm. And we sort of presuppose these categories or these transcendental ideas in our experience of the world, and therefore there has to be some kind of God or divine mind, that these things, these ideas, concepts, categories are all held in metaphorically. And so he basically says that proves the existence of God. So even in Kant was a Christian too, but even in the 1700s, you have people using Platonism, ideas that are almost 2,000 years old or more, for their own Christian ideas or their own philosophical ideas. So Christianity is absolutely a Platonic religion.
And it would make sense that they would take something and kind of, right, and on the mysteries, it's where they talk about like theurgy and like rituals and all that stuff, and calling upon something higher, right, to enact a change in reality, and that's prayer, like that's, and how you're saying, you put it really, really well, where, you know, they're focused on elevating the mind, you know, to transcend the mind. And once you transcend, you don't stay up there, you come back and you see the world with new eyes, right? You're enlightened, if you will, the enlightened ones. And it would make sense that,
not only are you enlightened, but the world is enlightened, meaning the world you look at is now vibrant. It's radiating with something.
You came out of Plato's cave and now you see everything behind your light.
Yeah.
It would make sense that they would take that and they would invert it to where, you're saying, you know, the Orthodox Church, they practice, I think, like more ritual, more meditation. They practice that, right? Like that. I know maybe one or two people who are Greek Orthodox or whatever it's called, and that would make sense that they would get away from that, because you don't want people who are going to be thinking. You're going to want people who are going to do what they're told. So that's where you get today's religion, where I always say, you know, fuck religion. I believe in God, where today's religion is a brokered experience. So it's like, hey, we'll hold the gates down for you. Go out there, do your thing, and we'll let you know when the Pope or whoever it is talks to God, and we'll let you know what he says, you know.
I think Carl Jung said that organized religion is there to protect against the religious experience. Yeah. And I always like that, you know.
No, absolutely.
Shield against direct religious
It's
experience.
A business. Like that in reality, that's what it is. It's a business. And you know, you've turned my house into a den of thieves, where, you know, it's they're just churning money out. And back then it was like, no. Think, bro. Yeah. Sit there and analyze and think. And it seems like more people today don't think. I mean, that's what you see a majority of.
Honestly, that was a big reason why we published the book, because I own a metaphysical bookstore. I'm on the front lines. I'm talking to people. I'm selling people books that are spiritual, that are philosophical. And I see a lot of people, and they're truth seekers. There's nothing wrong with them or anything. But a lot of the new age sought to, you know, starting in the 60s, sought to overcorrect for intellectualism. They thought religion had become too intellectualized, and too far from the religious experience. Excuse me. And they sought to bring spirituality back to the heart, back to direct experience, and all that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think that it went too far. I think that in a lot of the new age spirituality of today, it's very dumbed down. It's very animalistic, so to speak, where it's like, you know, it's just love and live from the heart and all this stuff. And it's like, okay, yeah, that stuff's great. Of course, that's part of spirituality, but that's only half the story. You know, the gnosis, or the knowledge, the intellect, is the other half. And you, like you said, you have to think things through. You have to come to an understanding of the world. You know, the idea of raising consciousness or expanding consciousness literally means expanding your awareness. It means knowing more, you know, experiencing more, but in a way where you understand it, you know. And that was a big part of the appeal of Platonism to me. The reason we published it was I read it and I thought, wow, like this is an education. If you read Plato, you read Plotinus, you read Iamblichus, like these people teach you how to think. Not
Or on the
only
Republic. I mean, that.
yeah, right, just the Republic, exactly, or just one Platonic dialogue, and you start realizing, oh, holy shit, like I make a lot of assumptions in my day to day. When you say soul and I say soul, we're just assuming we mean the same thing.
Yeah.
When you say justice and I say justice, or you say virtue and I say virtue, or whatever it is, or you say evil and I say evil, we're making these assumptions that we're on the same page. The Platonists make no such assumptions. They define everything. They recognize that philosophy is a language game, and therefore, if it's a language game, then the necessary conclusion is to get your terms straight, get your vocabulary defined well, before they even hop on a podcast. I'm obviously joking.
They were doing the OG podcast, bro.
Before they even hop on to a talk, they're like, okay, what do you mean by soul? Before we even get started, forget about where the soul comes from or whatever. Like, what the hell do you even mean by soul? And those are the questions that nobody in the New Age is asking.
So you're telling me that the Ashtar Galactic Command is not beaming down, consciousness expanding, blue rays, Project Blue Beam to expand our consciousness, bro? The White Brotherhood isn't to hold accountable for this? Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. It does take a little thinking. It's not the whole story. The intellect is not the whole story either. You still have to be a good person. You still have to want direct experience and live from the heart, all those sorts of things that I think the New Age did a good job of popularizing. I think that's all very good. But I think we overcorrected. We went a little too far, and we need to get back to center with intellect. People need to be reading Plato. People need to be reading philosophy. They need to, fine, you want to manifest, you want to do yoga, whatever, that's great. But let's also go read.
Want to touch the rocks and the crystals and all that.
Let's go read the greatest minds that have ever been there. And you will realize really quickly that your language is so vague. That's one of the biggest realizations. If you read the Republic and they're talking about what justice is, what it means to be just or fair, I mean, it's 50 pages of just back and forth, oh, well, is it just if somebody more powerful, overpowers somebody, is that the natural order, and therefore it's just, and on and on and on about why, no, that's not just.
Well, if it was Crowley, he'd be like, sometimes other people's will no means yes. Right.
Yeah. That's right. Well, and I think that, reading these people, getting a metaphysical education, an education on logic, on cosmology, on how to analyze forms and ideas, and just a general philosophical education prepares you it gives you an element of discernment. It sharpens your mind for when you're going into, I'm reading Crowley, or I'm reading the Upanishads, or I'm reading whatever, Francis Bacon, doesn't matter. You now have a newfound faculty for analysis, for thinking, real contemplative thinking, where you can throw stuff out really fast. You can read stuff and be like, oh, okay, this guy doesn't know anything about metaphysics, doesn't know anything about philosophy. This is all low hanging fruit stuff, and just toss it. You can really quickly start to identify people who can think and people who are grifters or pandering or trying to sell something or just wacky. And you start to collect thinkers, people who are really sharp. At least that's what I find.
And it would make sense as to why mathematics was so important to them, right? You mentioned earlier beauty, symmetry, asymmetry, and part of the whole Platonic thing was learning about math, wasn't it? Whose academy was that? At the top of it, you needed to.
Yeah, that was Plato, yeah, about geometry. I forget the exact phrase, but it's something like,
Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here.
yeah. And, you know, they were obsessed, and this kind of comes back to it, what we said earlier. They were obsessed with the geometry because there's a few things there, but primarily because geometry offers perfect definitions.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I said earlier, the Platonists are obsessed with definitions. They want to know, what is this thing? You know, what is virtue? What is, you know, the soul? What is the mind? Blah, 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 whatever. They want to know what things are and be able to put it into a sentence. This is what it is. And in geometry, you can do that better than in any other science or any other art. A triangle is a three-sided object that adds up, where the three angles add up to 180 degrees, period. Always. Doesn't matter what the angles are or what the side lengths are. It has three sides, three angles that add up to 180 degrees, period. Sorry, my dog's
You're familiar?
Yes, my familiar is bothering me. And that is why they loved it. That's like the ultimate for Platonists. They're like, oh mama, you know, I can define something in one sentence and it's exact. It never changes. That's what a triangle is and always will be. And that was the ultimate for them, because they said, what if we can, you know, what if our idea of a soul was as exactly defined as a triangle is? And so that's why it was it was of such a high level of order or of being, things like geometry, because it had this exactness, this you know, it participates in eternity, geometry, because these things are unchanging. They're sort of laws of nature or of being, and they were sort of a glimpse into the divine mind too. And you know, there's things like proportion, and you could go in geometry forever.
Well, and if we go even further back, Pythagoras, right, who influenced Plato, it's like the Pythagoreans saw divinity as number, right? Yeah. All is number. Like that to me is, the Pythagoreans are really interesting to me because, in my opinion, I think that they believe that it would contribute to the cosmology of us being in a sort of simulation, which if you really go back to, like, for example, like the Gnostics and all that, that's what it was, like this false reality that the demiurge, or the demiurgos, or whatever they called him, casted upon everyone in reality, and you're partaking in this, and you have to learn how to break free from that. You have to learn to transcend the aeons to go to be reunited with the one, right?
Yeah. The Plotinus hated the Gnostics, by the way.
Did he really?
Yeah, the Neoplatonists and the Gnostics butt heads big time. They existed at the same time in roughly the same areas. You had Gnostic sects or cults or whatever you want to call them in North Africa, in Egypt, in Alexandria, at the same time as the Neoplatonist movement with Plotinus and Porphyry. And Plotinus and Porphyry both, if you look this up, there's one of them is in Monad, have essays against the Gnostics, literally titled "Against the Gnostics" or on the Gnostics.
And this one in the Monad?
Yeah, there's one in Monad.
I didn't see that one. Let's see here.
It's on the Gnostic hypostases. Show you. Find what page it's on. On Intellect.
The three hypostases, the ranks as the principal thing. Oh, the Gnostic. Yeah, here we go. And that which is beyond them, 278.
Right. So, page 278 on the Gnostic hypostases and that which is beyond them. He also has one that's called Against the Gnostics, where they were trying to debunk the Gnostic movement, saying, look, this is low-level philosophy. Like, this demiurge dualism stuff.
This is the philosophy we have at home.
Right. Yeah, the philosophy at home is Gnosticism. And Neoplatonism just saw it, in my opinion, is just like a way more complete system.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Gnosticism's like fragments of stuff, and there's really interesting ideas in there. There's things to be gained, but in the Platonist mind, Gnosticism was totally ridiculous because it was dualistic. And to them, everything is ultimately unified into a one. There has to be an end, an absolute at the top or the bottom or wherever the hell it is, the center, from which everything emanates from or is created by. And so if everything is ultimately reconciled into one, which is good and unified and all of these things, then things like a demiurge are just silly. To them, they thought that the material world, yes, was not good, but it was still participating in it, or came from the source, from the one, and therefore was good ultimately. It was just less good than a higher realm. And so they thought that the material world was very far from source, from the one, and therefore had its issues, its traps and decaying and all that kind of stuff. But it was not actually evil, which I find to be probably closer to the truth. The Gnostics are definitely overreacting, I would say. And yeah, they just thought that, basically there's no such thing as the world being split in two at the top. It's always unified into one. It's always reconciled into one. And if there's two opposites, like the spiritual and material, or the demiurge and God, at some level, at the highest possible level, it's always reconciled. The two opposites reconcile into one that contains them both. And so if you're not looking at things from that ultimate perspective, then you're still just like lost in a sort of mental trap. You haven't climbed the ladder to the top, so to speak. So they kind of laughed off Gnosticism. They're like, this is just like a bad philosophical education.
Yeah, but again, like I said, for the people who don't want to think and just want everything kind of sort of handed to them, it would make sense where it's like, okay, I'm here because I have to participate in this trial of sorts, that is being constructed by this demon, right? And as long as I can do, the right steps, I can transcend, and then it's all over. And if I fail, then I come back again. So I got to make sure. And where do the Platonists and the Neoplatonists and everything, where do they stand as far as like the mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries and all that? Did they participate in all that? Like, did they?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two things there. One, you mentioned reincarnation. The Platonists absolutely, and Neoplatonists absolutely believed in reincarnation. In Greek philosophy, it's referred to as metempsychosis. That's like the Greek term for reincarnation. They absolutely believed in souls coming back into human bodies. They did not think a soul could be split up in any way.
That's why they didn't eat animals, right? That's why they were vegetarian?
It's a big part of it, yeah. They believe that they were conscious agents and that they did have souls. By the way, the word animal has a soul. Anima, like anima mundi, world soul. Anima is soul, the word. So, yeah, they thought animals had
Who do you think
version.
your dog was in a past life?
Who my dog was in past life? That's a good question.
Right? Have you ever like called out a name to see if she responds like looks
No,
over at you?
Definitely really silly though. I don't know, maybe some kind of mime or comedian.
Yeah, pugs are funny dogs already though. Like they're
ridiculous dogs,
yeah.
But so they absolutely had reincarnation, and they absolutely were participating in the mysteries. Plato went to Eleusis, at least from what we know. Emperor Julian, who was a Neoplatonist, Roman emperor, he went to Eleusis. We know that. And others, a lot of them performed Orphic rites or other mysteries. They absolutely were involved in these things. And then finally, when you get to Iamblichus, who I've called the bad boy, because he's the most occult. He is a magician. He is not a meditator, a contemplator, like Plotinus and Porphyry and the rest.
Let's do rituals and ceremonies, baby.
Iamblichus is sharp as they come, but he is a ceremonial magician. He calls it theurgy. When Plotinus says theurgy, he means contemplation. He means what I described earlier, a dialectical process of enlightenment. When Iamblichus says theurgy, he means drawing the circle, putting out the proper stones to the proper planets,
calling down the deities.
Yeah, to the scents, the aromas, whatever it is. He's performing sympathetic magic. That's Iamblichus. That's why I said he's the bad boy. He becomes full materialist. And when you adopt the materialist paradigm, you are left with the idea that spirituality or enlightenment must go through matter. If the world is made of matter, well, then you have to sort of align it in harmonious ways to achieve higher orders of things, to achieve your goals or to be in harmony. Gregory Shaw, who wrote a really good book called Theurgy and the Soul, highly recommend people read that, on Iamblichus. He describes it as in the Platonic or Plotinian tradition, the person is trying to how would I describe this? They're trying to put themselves into harmony, like in their own mind, like through this contemplation. They're trying to create harmony or align themselves with their true self, harmony in their own mind. Whereas in the Iamblican tradition, the materialist tradition, the Iamblichus is trying to put himself in harmony with the world, with the cosmos. And so that's how he sees success or a higher order of being achieved, is putting himself into harmony and sort of knowing his place and connecting himself to the world in the best way possible. And that leads to magic. It's ceremonial magic. They call it theurgy. It's sympathetic magic. It's geomancy, it's astrology, it's divination. It's all of the above, like you said, invocations of daemons and things of the like. So Iamblichus is absolutely participating in all the mysteries. He wants it all. Iamblichus thought, his book is called On the Mysteries, literally. And he talks about Eleusis, by the way, and Bacchic rites and things like that. So you can read Iamblichus' thoughts on Eleusis, translated by Thomas Taylor. I mean, this is as good as it gets. And the reason that he wrote on the mysteries, he wrote about a lot of different mysteries, including like tarot divination, not literally.
You think he was spilling the beans like for his time?
Yes, but I'll get to that. The reason that he wrote about mysteries instead of just like, oh, what is justice or whatever, what is virtue, is he believed that the Platonic cosmology was most evident when the veil was thinnest. So during these mysteries or during the study of astrology or whatever, all these weird occult things, he believed that was when you could see the Platonic cosmology at play. And in your just day-to-day life, you could have an understanding that that's how things work. But he believed that, if you were at Eleusis or you were in a seance or you were, performing magic for something, for some kind of goal, that's when you can see how things work. And so that he made it a study and wrote a book called On the Mysteries. And he outlines, that how all these things work, basically, how things come into being, how, things like tarot cards can be imbued with intellect, for a brief moment, things like that. He details how that all works in a Platonic worldview. And it's fascinating. Absolutely a huge, huge deal. Like you talked about spilling the beans. When Iamblichus writes these books, On the Mysteries becomes a must read for everyone that's interested in the esoteric. because it's one of the only books that really tries to say what the hell is going on here, like from a philosophical point of view, or cosmology and all these weird things. And he lays the groundwork for ceremonial magic, for alchemy, for up until today. He lays the foundation of why do these things. If you don't believe that matter is divine, or that sympathy between things, between a planet and a color or whatever, that's important, then you wouldn't be doing alchemy or ceremonial magic or anything like that. And up until him, we didn't have anyone saying, yeah, it was being taught in mystery schools for sure. And it was esoteric knowledge, but we didn't have anyone actually coming out and saying, this is how sympathetic magic works. The reason that a planet and a certain color are connected is because of this in our world, in our cosmology. This is how it works. And that is fascinating. And that is, one of the essential texts for all of occultism. All the Western esoteric tradition is Platonic in that view, more of a materialist Platonism. But a lot of people do call the Neoplatonists the secret teachings of Plato. So there's two ideas. Some people think the Neoplatonists took Pythagoras and Plato and Aristotle, and they added on. And what they added on happened to be a lot of mystical stuff.
Yeah.
And the more scholarly people think, well, that's because they were in Egypt and they have these influences coming from the Middle East, maybe from India, from Egypt itself. And, Rome is very cosmopolitan. There's all these ideas flowing around, especially in Alexandria. And so they got Platonism, the traditional Platonism, and then added a lot of mystical stuff. That's one school. The other school believes that these teachings were not new, that the Neoplatonists were not coming up with anything. They were simply revealing what were previously, in the time of Plato, the secret teachings.
The Agrapha Dogmata, the unwritten doctrines.
Exactly. These were the spoken secret teachings of the Platonic academies of Pythagoras, even all the way back to Pythagoras, the Pythagorean brotherhoods, that these were what were taught esoterically or in the occult, and that they were not
initiates, to
the initiates, and they were not revealed to the public or to just philosophers or whatever, and that the Neoplatonists simply wrote them down and conveyed the secret teachings of Plato. I tend to believe that's probably the case, that these were not new ideas, that it's not like Plato didn't know about, this or that, but simply that we didn't know that Plato knew about that. It just wasn't written down. It wasn't preserved. It wasn't exoteric.
Yeah. And that's where you said, right, aligning yourself with the material and that gnosis and this higher sense of being is linked to the material. And that's it, like Hermes Trismegistus and all these guys came out. They were like, okay, alchemy. We're going to do the work and purify material to its highest form of being. So that's amazing, because they took something that, because if you think about it, it's almost like this evolution. That's why I love history, like reading and learning about it, because you see the evolution of it. So these alchemists took this, how you're saying, this philosophical thought experiment-esque type of ideas, and they brought it down into a lab where they could do all of that.
Yeah. But
tinkering with it, like, here, stare into this vessel for X amount of time, and you might start to hallucinate. Oh, is that a dragon? And then they're forming all these different symbols that convey a higher meaning. But hey, we're also gonna keep this secret. So make sure that you do the signs how you're supposed to. All the other guys in the group and in the club are gonna know what you're talking about. But for those that can't have this knowledge, this sacred knowledge, they're going to stay out. Right?
Sure.
And they're going to think, oh, what beautiful art. And in reality, they're telling you the secrets of reality.
Right.
Drawn on this notebook, whatever it is. Dude, I love it.
Yeah, they, I guess with Plato, we don't exactly know about how these things were written down. We don't have records about how, who was writing it down or how it was preserved, anything like that. There were absolutely tons of Platonic materials that were older than Plato. Like, people suggest that the Parmenides is older than Plato. It's attributed as a work of Plato, but people suspect that some of these things are Pythagorean. They're from hundreds of years before Plato, and then we simply say that they're by Plato. And so there's things that probably weren't by him and are even older, and there's things that were lost, or were preserved esoterically. I mean, without a doubt. Yeah, I love this stuff too, because I agree with you. You can see things unfold in history. Mm-hmm. You can see these ideas moving across boundaries and inspiring things. And yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, like I said, if you don't have a certain philosophy about life or about spirituality or about, meaning, then you just aren't going to end up at alchemy. Mm-hmm. You're not going to, you're going to be like, what do you mean? Who cares about rocks?
Because you have to know, how you said earlier about like the translations, you have to know the context, and the context is very important. And that's why religion, to me, right, we're speaking of translations and how important they are. That's why a lot of religion to me is probably bullshit, because how do we truly know that, for example, right, King James didn't do something with Bacon and all these other guys, right? Like the first Freemason or something or other. How can we truly trust? And people will go to like the end of the world, like, no, the King James is the word of God. And it's like, so then what about the other copies that had to switch things up because they didn't want to combat the copyright of the original? Is that also the word of God? I mean, it's still changed up a little bit, but and a lot of this stuff wasn't translated till hundreds of years later. That's one of the things. And one time I heard you, I forgot what it was that you said, where it kind of fell in line with Philip K. Dick in a sort of way, where a lot of the stuff that was like in the Nag Hammadi and like the Dead Sea Scrolls was stuff that these symbols that had already been translated before, and almost like finding the Nag Hammadi and releasing these things into the world kind of set forth this chain reaction that was already known in the esoteric and the occult, right? Almost as if, right, a lot of those texts are Gnostic. It plays in role with Philip K. Dick, where he's like, yeah, the Gnostics, they were actually the Gnostics because they were infected with this interdimensional disease that needs you to help it keep going, and then it uses you. And then when you look into like information being a sort of informational parasite, where information and language uses you to keep going, and you're a vessel for that said thing. Where do you think that, because you're pretty passionate about conserving this sort of knowledge and it being lost to today's society, because I'm sure you could go to the superstore right now or any supermarket or any Walmart and ask somebody about Plato, and they probably don't even know who he is or never ever interacted with any of his works. Where do you see us in 1,000 years, dude, with ChatGPT and all this stuff? Do you think that we're going to go into a dark ages?
No, I don't. I don't think we'll go into a dark ages, because a dark age, like we've specified before, is typically characterized by ignorance. Yes, I get what you're saying, that your common person might not be aware of these things, but that's kind of always been the case. The scary part is when the intellectual elite are not aware of these things, like in the Middle Ages, where it's not that they weren't educated on Plato. They didn't even have Plato. It's not that they weren't educated on how to build domes and architecture. They didn't even know, they didn't even have it anymore. And I think with things like ChatGPT and the rest, that we have an overload of information. So I think we'll be all right on knowledge. But I think that we'll run into some issues on other, sort of like ethics and things
Yeah,
like
but it
that.
can't. ChatGPT can't tell you and explain to you the essence of being. What is justice? What is XYZ?
Sure.
Like it's pulling that information from the internet. It's a large language model.
Yeah. I mean, we'll see what happens with it. It definitely is not a bad resource for, if you want to look up Plotinus's ideas or Plato. Yeah, it's not the most trustworthy, but it could give you some kind of primer, what did, Plato's Republic summary or something, and you could get somewhat of an education. But, it'll be integrated, I guess. I'm no futurist at all. A few things that you touched on earlier that are interesting, though, is with the material, like you mentioned Hermes Trismegistus and alchemy, Iamblichus uses a proof for the divinity of matter. So he's saying matter is divine. It comes from God. And I'm going to prove that it's important. And the way that he does this is he says there's something called Platonic recollection. The Platonists always say, you don't learn anything, you just remember it.
Yeah, you're always remembering.
Right? That intellect, or that nous that we talked about earlier, that's connected to the divine mind, to God, because it's connected to the divine mind, it knows everything. Where it came from, it knows everything, at least. Therefore, when you're learning something, or when you're uncovering something in your intellect, you're simply remembering it. It's called recollection in Platonism. And Iamblichus said, well, in order to recollect something or to learn something, you have to see it played out in front of you. You learn something by seeing it. And therefore, matter is the vehicle for recollection, for learning. So he said that the material world is necessary for learning things or remembering things. We learn by seeing things played out in front of us, or drawn out in front of us, or acted out, and we wouldn't have any understanding or knowledge without that sort of experience. And he said, therefore, matter is divine. It's a bridge to where our soul came from, to the divine mind, to the intellect, the nous. And so that things like that, right? That proof of the divinity of matter, and through Platonic recollection, lays a groundwork for all of esoteric materialism, all of magic, all, like you said, alchemy, the Hermetic tradition. All of that is founded on these philosophical ideas, and nobody laid it out like the Neoplatonists. Another thing you touched on was actually you just randomly brought up the Nag Hammadi library. I forgot to bring that up when we were talking about early Christianity, that if you Google the Nag Hammadi library and look at the books that were found there, a lot of them are early Gospels or Old Testament books. I'm not too familiar with it, but Dead Sea Scrolls, what have you. Guess what else was found on the same shelf in one of these little caves was The Republic by Plato.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So you'll see all these biblical books and religious books, and then you see The Republic. And that just tells you these things were existing side by side. Plato was held in the utmost regard. He is
Plato.
Yeah,
That's
isn't that crazy?
Wild. Didn't know that.
And you just see, you go down the list, and everything else is like gospel or whatever, and then The Republic, just square in the middle.
Crazy.
Isn't that crazy? So yeah, they're a big deal. Worth reading. And when you were talking about translations, by the way, it also brought something up in my mind, which was that in the Islamic world, the Arab Islamic world, they had a text. And you could look this up too. The Arab Islamic world had a text which was titled in Arab, The Complete Works of Aristotle. And they used this it was like central to the Islamic education of philosophy. They were all studying it. Complete works of Aristotle. Oh, we're all reading Aristotle. And guess what we found out, Juan? Hundreds of years later, we find out that the book that they had titled The Complete Works of Aristotle was actually the Enneads of Plotinus, under a false title. Someone had titled it Aristotle, and it was Plotinus. And so Islamic philosophy, especially Sufism, but a lot of the more mystical aspects, and even just the theology of Islam, is Neoplatonic. Neoplatonism had a massive role in Islam. For example, they don't have a trinity.
Mm-hmm.
They have one God. They have a unity. That's very Neoplatonic already. To get rid of any division, if there's ultimate unity, things like that. But it's kind of a funny story though. They thought they were studying Aristotle and they were studying Plotinus.
Yeah.
for like a few hundred years, and had no idea. And
that
so
would
Plotinus,
probably make a difference, right?
It would make a big difference, yeah. So and it's funny, they were studying Plotinus and having their golden age, while science and alchemy and learning and math, while Europe was studying Aristotle and they were in their dark age, which is kind of funny. He was a materialist, so it doesn't lead to a lot of beauty and things like that. It's kind of I don't know.
We're probably living in an Aristotelian era now, where it's
absolutely, yeah, science and reason, and
literally up until Aristotelian biology wasn't changed up until like the 18th century, very late 18th century, which is wild, dude.
Absolutely, yeah. Aristotle is dominant right now. We have too much Aristotle, not enough Plato, I think, because Plato is very mystical, very transcendent, spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle believed that the forms and sort of the spiritual world was in matter, that matter was a primary substance, the prima materia, things like that it was like a source from which, almost like a background, like material that everything is like coming out of, like an ether kind of deal, things like that. Yeah, these people are, and there's modern day Platonists right now. It's not like the tradition is dead. The guy who wrote the introduction, Ken Wheeler, is a modern day Platonist. He's a translator of ancient Greek, of ancient Pali, ancient Sanskrit. He's a strange character for sure. I think he has like 300,000 something subscribers on YouTube. He's pretty popular, but he is a savant. He understands metaphysics and these big questions of philosophy.
I've seen this guy before.
Yeah, as well as anyone. He wrote the introduction to Monad.
Yeah, but I didn't know his face, and now I saw him on YouTube, and now I've seen him.
Yeah, super, super smart. He's hard to crack, because I'll be honest, in his videos, he kind of assumes that a lot of stuff. And if you're a beginner, it can be really tough. But once you get initiated into this Platonic way of thinking, he is just delivering gold. And again, he'll give you kind of an education too. He's really great. In the 20th century, you had people like Alfred North Whitehead, who was a Platonist. He famously said that all of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato, which is a great quote. You have people like Rupert Sheldrake today that I would say are Platonists, and many others. It's still a living tradition. It's a rich tradition too. It goes back, if you're including Pythagoras, 2,500 years.
Yeah.
As far as Western philosophy goes, that is absolutely ancient.
That's why I'd be interested again to see where we're at in 1,000 years, if things have changed, if things have been, kept, if we keep a record or not. And like you said, there is an overabundance of information, but it feels like no one does anything with that information. And that can be overwhelming for some, this informational and ideological soup that you're in, Where do you go? How do you find it? And not saying that all these dudes were right, but they had a strong foundation. And how you're saying it's important for people to at least read some of Plato's works,
Sure.
even if it is, read whatever. Read Timaeus. Read the Republic.
Yeah.
That's my favorite. The
I think
Republic.
the Republic is like 100 something pages. It's pretty small.
Yeah, and
I mean,
it's wild. I mean that when I first read that, I think I have like a Penguin Press copy of it or something like this paperback. I bought it in Miami actually.
Oh, yeah?
You just read it and I don't know. We'll see where we're at, and that's why it's important for people to go check out the book, the Monad. That way,
we're gonna publish the Republic, Thomas Taylor translation of the Republic in probably a year. But yeah, definitely read Monad. It's also a great book because you can open up to any page. It is not a book. It's not a novel that has to be read front to back. You can open up to a random page and start reading. On the Plotinus section, which is the first half of the book, that's his book, his works called the Enneads. The Enneads are a series of essays, so every chapter is a separate thing that it can be read completely on its own. And he covers topics like the existence of evil, virtue, happiness, beauty, nature and origin of evil, suicide, even matter, on eternity and time. Like, these are huge topics. These are not like a stoicism or something like my day-to-day life. These are the big things. They want to start big and then work down to the small and be like, okay, if you have an understanding of the source of all things and how the world is strung together and what matter is like and time is like, well, then it's like almost the things in your day-to-day life or how to arrange your mind or whatever fall into place. It's like, well, it's almost obvious from there. Whereas a lot of other people would take be like, okay, once I have my life figured out, then I can worry about, matter and happiness and, whatever else.
Yeah, the Stoics were just like, I just want to chill.
Yeah.
Leave me alone.
On the immortality of the soul, these are all chapters. That chapter is 15 pages on the immortality of the soul. So you can pick up this book. Yes, it's 818 pages. You can pick up this book and read 15, 20 page chapter and take notes, and you're going to be getting like prime time education on metaphysics. Again, are there things I disagree with? Yes, I will read the chapter on happiness or on whatever and be like, nah, their conclusion's not my conclusion. But seeing them work through the dialectic and the reasoning to get to that conclusion is a master course of thinking. Then you're like, oh shit, like, whatever, their conclusion wasn't mine. And sometimes, Plotinus is such a freak mind that he'll even give you both sides of the answer. So like, here's a good example on the nature and origin of evil. In Neoplatonism, there is no evil. There's no absolute evil, meaning evil is not a thing like good is a thing. Evil is just a lack of good. It's like a shadow, right? A shadow is not a thing. It's just a lack of light. That's their view of evil. They say that, at least Plotinus, that evil is either caused by free will, by humans, human misdoings, or a lack of goodness. It's just, whatever it was, it's far from the source. It's in the shadow. And that's evil. And to me, that's not really a satisfactory answer, to be totally honest. Because if you watch, if you study evil, you study Stalin or serial killers or Epstein or just these horrible things, you're like, I don't know, man. Of course, that can fall under the free will too. But you see things where you're like, I don't know, there's something absolute about this, And Jung straight up in Aeon directly calls out the Neoplatonists for this because it's called what do they call it?
By the way, Hitler did read Plato, so
yeah. The thing is, everyone read Plato before. Is like assumed that you like had an education. It was like reading whatever, just like the classics. But anyways, this sort of privation of good idea, Jung really hated it because he studied the human mind. He said, "Oh no, there's absolute evil, and I've seen it. There is something dark." And I was like underwhelmed by Plotinus's answer. I'll say that because he said, no, the world is ultimately good. The monad is goodness itself. And therefore, there's no bookend at the other end that's absolute evil. It's not absolute good, absolute evil on two sides of the universe. And they're battling each other like in Gnosticism. He said there's good at the top, and the further things get away from good, I guess the more evil they get. Or human free will can also be evil. And I read that, but his conclusion is the world is good. There is evil, but it's good overall because everything comes out of the one. And there's no evil doesn't have sort of attributes of itself, just simply privation of good. And I was underwhelmed, but then at the end of the chapter, he hits you with the other side. He comes all the way back around. He says, oh, you know what? Maybe there is absolute evil. And I was like, oh my God, this guy's like answering both points of view. Like, it's totally crazy. He comes around, he says, maybe there is absolute evil. He said, I'll give you that. Okay, there's absolute evil. There's a Satan, or there's whatever, this black anchor at the bottom of the world that's absolute evil itself, just like at the top there's absolute good. And he said, even then, when there's absolute evil, the world is still good overall, because with absolute evil and absolute good, those two things, like bookends, give order to the world and balance. And order, organization and balance are all good things. They're all good aspects. Isn't that crazy?
Because then you have a scale to compare it to. Yeah, right. It makes perfect sense.
This orderliness is actually reconciled into a good, even in that worldview. So he gives you both cases. He gives you his personal opinion that there's no evil, it's just a privation. But he said, even in the opposite idea, when you have absolute evil, like Jung would argue for, even then the world is still good, because the attributes which absolute evil lends to the world as a counterforce, it gives a finiteness to the world. It's no longer infinite, it's finite. And that finiteness is good. It's orderly, it's organized, it's balanced. All of these words you could say about the overall aspects, not about evil itself, but that the overall condition of the world, given absolute evil, are good things. And so even then he's able to, again, that's the dialectic, use these two opposites to be reconciled into a higher unity of goodness. And I was blown away. I started off read that chapter, and I was like getting through it, and I was like, I don't know, man. I think there's definitely evil. There's some really bad stuff, like really hard to even imagine stuff in history and in the current day. And at the end, he gave me my answer. It wasn't his answer, but he knew that people would disagree, and he said he'll take that anyways and spin it around and show you that it works towards his case in the end anyway.
I want to get back together. So the last time we got back together was over 2 years ago. Yeah. Or 2 years. Because the last episode I published with you and I was December 25th, 2023.
No way.
So, yeah, we got to get back together sooner than later. And I want to do an episode on Iamblichus. I want to talk about Iamblichus on the mysteries.
Oh, yeah. And he has, give it a read. I can send you a copy if you want a copy.
Yeah, I got that hardcover copy. I'll read that. We'll get back together, and then we'll talk more about the monad and the Iamblichus, because that's super interesting to me. Where it takes a turn, because right, we're talking about these people who are very meditative, and then out of nowhere, it's like after that the occult is just like rampant, you know, like after, because the Egyptians are the first alchemists, right? I mean, that's where the origins of alchemy are. And I forgot who it was. I think it was it was Bruno.
That was, by the way, his thesis. His book is called on the mysteries of the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. I think
the
he
Chaldeans
says
too. I think, right?
Chaldeans, the Chaldean oracles. Those books were really influential in the Neoplatonists. But he has this thesis because Plotinus and Porphyry were saying, oh, you know, let's go back to the old stuff. You know, forget Aristotle, forget like this kind of materialist stuff. Let's go back to Plato. Because Plotinus is like the 200s. So Plato is like 400 years before him, 500 years. So the Neoplatonists were fairly late, you know, compared to Plato. Like they were going back a few hundred years and reviving the tradition. And by the time it gets to Iamblichus, he's like, oh no, let's go back like way further. Like,
that's why he wrote about Pythagoras then, right? He's the biographer.
Yeah, right. He wants to go to Pythagoras and back as far as he can, the Egyptians, you know. And that's why, like you said, he revives all of that. You know, people, I'm sure, were interested in Egyptian stuff and Assyrian stuff, Babylonian, Chaldean. But Iamblichus was like, no, I'm bringing it back in a big way. And I'm going to make it part of our worldview. And unbelievably important. Like I said, if you read On the Mysteries by Iamblichus, translated by Thomas Taylor, and then go read Theurgy in the Soul by Gregory Shaw, who's currently alive, and you could get him on your show probably. He's really good. He does podcasts. If you go read his book afterwards, which is about On the Mysteries, it's about Iamblichus, you will have like a full education on that line of thinking. Like I did it. I read both and took notes. And by the end, I was like, wow, I feel like a expert or something, you know?
And I forgot what it was. I think it was either Bruno or Ficino, one of those two that was talking about Trismegistus being he predicted Christianity. I don't know if you've ever heard about that. Like he was like a Christian messiah of some sorts.
This is Bruno, yeah.
It was Bruno, right? Yeah, I remember reading that with Yates. But yeah, no, we'll get back together. I'll read that, and then we'll chop it up with that because I love this sort of a line of thinking, and I want to dig more into the occult side of it, dude. And I want to like
Bruno, by the way, thought that Jesus was crucified on an ankh.
Really?
Yeah, like that the cross he was on had the circle at the top.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
He wasn't burned at the stake for that. He was burned at the stake for
other things,
for some other stuff. But
God bless him, though. I mean, can you imagine?
No, I can't.
You know, he was in captivity with the Inquisition for 7 years, Bruno. 7 years, and he wouldn't concede. You know, they would come in and be like, "Hey, like, just drop it." You know, like, just accept like Catholic dogma, like stop talking.
They just want you to recant like what you said, or they're just like, take it back. He's like, nope.
He's like, no. And for 7 years, and they're like torturing you. I mean, unreal. And it's we're releasing a limited print of Giordano Bruno at the stake. We had an artist do a rendition of it out of Portugal. It's really cool. I'll send it to you. We're gonna do posters, like only 100 of them. As like a promotional item for the book that comes out in March. And we included in it a Masonic secret about Bruno, which a customer who's a master mason of a lodge in New Jersey, who comes to the bookstore, he told me about this. He said that when they teach you about Bruno in Masonry, it's said that when they put him on at the stake, they put a necklace around him of bags of gunpowder, so that he would almost literally explode when they lit him on fire.
Decapitate him, yeah.
And I don't know why the Masons teach that. That is not found anywhere else. I've Googled it. I've looked everywhere. It's like Masonic mythology for some reason. I'm not sure if it's symbolic or whatever. but we did in our print, we included that little detail.
I wonder what happened to they were fine. Oh, his ashes were thrown into the Tiber River.
Yeah, the Tiber.
Interesting. Well, dude, I really enjoyed this conversation. Super enlightening, super, super interesting. Where can people go to find your work again if they want to purchase a copy? Limited in copies. Hopefully it's not going to be around for much longer. Where can they go?
So you can go to gallowglassbooks.shop. You can follow at gallowglassbooks on Instagram. I definitely wanted to give a shout out to my business partner, Tony Ferry. We are 50-50 partners, so it's not just me. He's also a part owner of the bookstore, The Dancing Elephant in South Florida. He's a huge force behind all of this. He is the one who got me to be passionate about book design, to see that not all books are created equal, that there are beautiful books, that book design used to be an art form, that frontispieces used to be an art form, book covers, typesetting, all of these things were crafts that used to be in demand and that great artists would put a lot of work into. And he got me to see all of that and kind of start collecting beautiful books. And I had the idea to start a publishing company only a few months after opening the bookstore, but he was really the creative or artistic force behind it to get me to, I would have maybe just published things that are out of print, just in paperback or whatever. That he got me to kind of be a book snob and be like really into the paper and like having them be hardcover and like all these little details to make them beautiful, beautiful books. So he's a big part of this too. He could be cool to have on some other time too. He's a smart guy. I definitely had to acknowledge him.
For sure, yeah. Put me through to him and we'll get back together here soon.
Sure.
Not in 2 years. Not in 2027.
Yeah, I think I did something with you on Rudolph that was not that long ago. But maybe still like a year and a half, probably.
I think it was that live, the live that we did, right? Rudolph, think the Alchemical Emperor, April. Still, dude, April 15th, 2023. We streamed that live.
Yeah. So. And Bruno was with Rudolph, so that book comes out in March. That one's gonna be really cool. Really excited.
Yeah, we'll keep a lookout for that, dude. I'll post all the links in the description. And as always, everyone, if you enjoyed this, leave it a review, thumbs up, 5 stars, whatever. Make sure to follow the show on social media at the One-on-One Podcast. Make sure to follow Professor Longo and his work over there. Go visit the bookstore if you'd like down in South Florida, the Dancing Elephant. I've been there. It's great. It's a magical place. You go in there and you feel smarter just from being in there around all that knowledge and all those books. It's an awesome place, dude. And hopefully I'll see you soon here in person or something. I was supposed to go down for the holidays. I didn't end up going, but we'll link up here soon. And as always, everyone, make sure to love each other, be good, and we'll catch you on the next one. Bye.